Hi again guys, and welcome to another installment, of course, of Unsung Heroes. And to those of you who have heard of this car before, you're probably wondering, why is it in this series? Because it's a fairly well-known vehicle, in a similar way, to some extent, to last week's Maverick R4. It is a vehicle that has been featured in some games, and there's a decent amount of people who do know of the car. In the case of this one, probably not quite as many people, because it hasn't been featured in as famous a role in a game as the Colin McRae R4 was, of course, in the Dirt series. This one, though, has been featured in at least one game that I can recall, which was Tucker Race Driver. It was a secret vehicle that you could unlock, but apart from that, I don't recall it being featured in any other game. Now, it may well have been, and I'm just not aware of it, but that's the only one that comes to mind. And the car in question is, of course, the Koenig C62. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, based on the look of the car, that this is some kind of variation on the very popular early 90s theme of repurposing the iconic Porsche 962 Longtail into a street homologated vehicle. And that's exactly what it is. No surprise there, that is what the Koenig C62 is. But the reason why I'm including this car before something like a Schuppan or a Dauer 962, as loved as those are, is because of something which a lot of people don't actually realise. And that is that this one did it first. This came out before both the Dauer and the Schuppan, and although it's not as quick as either of those, the fact that it did it first is very significant. And also, given that it did do it first, you would think that a lot more people would talk about it, and yet they don't. The Dauer 962 is a pretty well-known car. It's an amazing car, basically the fastest supercar of the 90s, even though people don't give it that kind of credit because it wasn't production. And of course the Schuppan as well, although personally I'm not a fan of the Schuppan. It's my least liked of the three, not a fan of the look, but it is very quick, it's very expensive, very valuable. But this one came first, and that has to count for something. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with Koenig, they have no connection whatsoever to Koenig C62. None whatsoever. They're based in Munich, and they were originally a tuning company, a very extreme tuning company. They made stuff like 1,000 horsepower Ferrari Testarossas and 800 horsepower Ferrari F50s and 750 horsepower Ferrari F40s, all of which are, as you'd assume, incredibly quick. They have these big, crazy-looking body kits, which sometimes, let's be honest, look a little bit dated, but kind of in the best way. They're almost like the German equivalent of a Racer to some degree, with these crazy, slightly pointless body kits, but they do give the vehicles their unique appearance, and unlike most Racer cars, they actually back up the crazy looks with great performance. They are very, very fast. However, this is by far the fastest car they've ever built, not just in a straight line, but doubtless around the track as well, because of course it is. It's based on one of the most iconic and most dominant forces in any form of motorsport, the Porsche 962, which itself, of course, was essentially an evolution of what started with the 956, and you could say even earlier with the 917. Now, in the case of this car, of course, to meet road regulations, especially since nobody else had done it before, they had to change certain things. Now, it does actually use, impressively enough, an original 962 chassis. It is the chassis of the race car, which is very cool. The body, though, is of course completely different. The same shape, but clearly a different car. The lights are different, etc. And the reason why was twofold. One, the headlights had to be a different height on the road to be legal, and it needed clearance to be able to actually drive down the street without smashing over every pothole. So they redesigned their own carbon fibre body, and this car came out in 1991, which was a year before the Schuppan and a full 3 years before the Dauer, which came out in 1994. Now, of course, from a racing perspective, Dauer is the best of the three because they actually took it racing again in Le Mans under kind of new regulations. They were running the 962 shape, but it was more of a GT1 style machine, and they won, of course. Surprise, surprise, it was still an amazing car, which shows how good it was for its time to be able to win in the mid-90s as well. So this one, though, it was the first to do it, as I said, and as such, it was new ground. Schuppan could have learned from Koenig, and doubtless they did. Dauer could learn from Schuppan and Koenig, which doubtless they did. Koenig didn't have that. All they had was Porsche, which is a pretty good thing to learn from, but at the same time, there's no point of reference for using it on the street. So what they did is they slightly redesigned and retuned the way that it delivered its performance. Now, if you look up the specs of this car on the net, they are a bit contradictory. Some say around 600 horsepower, some say around 800. I'm inclined to believe the latter based on how powerful the 962 race cars were as well. It's incidentally a twin-turbo 3.4 litre flat six. So a nice boxer monster of an engine. Of course, mid-engine, rear-wheel drive. The quoted weight again varies between 1 metric ton, or 1,000 kilos, and about 1,100 kilos, so not a huge difference, and you'd expect a road-going version to be a bit heavier than the race car, which it is. It's got the better quality interior, for instance, probably a larger fuel tank, but I'm not certain on that, and certain things that you have to do on a street car that you just don't, of course, on a race car, and all of those things do add weight. But the thing you're probably wondering if you are unfamiliar with the car is how quick is it? Well, really quick. It's incredibly quick. In fact, it can easily take on a McLaren F1 because the top speed is around 235 miles per hour and 0 to 60 arrives in 3.3 seconds. So it ain't slow. That's for sure, especially bearing in mind that's in 1991. Now, the peak of 1991 was still stuff like the Bugatti EB110, the Ferrari F40, I believe, as well. Probably a couple of others that I'm not quite remembering. Maybe the XJ220, that might have been a little bit later. But that's the kind of rivalry that you would have. Good cars, but not exactly this level of good. In fact, nowhere near. This could have easily wiped the floor with every other supercar around at the time. And again, that's something which it just doesn't get the credit for. This was essentially the best supercar in the world in 1991. So why doesn't it get the credit? Well, that's the interesting thing, because with a lot of the cars in this series, Unsung Heroes, we can't really say why they didn't. There's just, for some reason, certain cars stick and others don't. Some get remembered and some get forgotten. Now, of course, the Schuppan is the more wacky, oddball, slightly better known one, but it's still pretty obscure, and I would assume that the best known of the three is probably the Dauer 962. And it's also the fastest, 251 miles per hour, 0 to 60 in 2.6 seconds. As I said, the fastest supercar of the 90s, easily faster than the McLaren F1, but just not a production car. They only built like 9 of them, so it didn't qualify. In the case of this one, though, nowhere near that quick, but quick, for sure. Now, as far as pricing, again, it varies, but it varies wildly. Some people are saying 300 grand, some people say over $1 million. That seems more accurate of the two, for sure, for a vehicle like this. And in terms of its overall packaging, its ability, its status in the supercar world, it's one of the biggest unsung heroes out there. So it's an ironic car because initially when you see it in this series, you probably think, as I mentioned earlier, why is it here? I know about this car. It's not really an unsung hero. And yet, it really is, for a number of reasons. People do not talk about it, and yet it was the first one of its kind to achieve such a momentous task of taking this incredible Porsche and making it street legal, which in itself makes it worthy of being talked about, but also the fact that it essentially was the ultimate supercar of the early 90s. Again, give this car more credit. It's an amazing supercar, a valiant effort from a brand who'd never done this before, and considering that no brand had ever done it before as well, I think this is definitely an unsung hero, and one which for sure deserves to be talked about more. So that's it for this installment. Of course, you can click through and see more weird and wacky vehicles in this series, but for now, as always, thanks for watching.